A former MMA fighter who once delivered knockout blows now finds himself on the receiving end of a gut punch. 3 years after admitting to a drug-fueled rage that ended in the murder of his fiancée, Phillip Keller has been sentenced to 50 years in prison for killing Alicia Campitelli. Let's dive right in. For Law and Crime News, I'm Kennedi Walker. When you look at pictures of Alicia and Phillip, you might see what seems like the perfect couple. Smiling faces, engagement photos, and a future that seemed bright and full of promise. But behind those smiles, behind those perfect moments, things weren't as they seemed. The MMA fighter was fighting a much darker battle, eventually leading to a heartbreaking tragedy. Let's start from the beginning. Alicia, or Red as her friends called her, was a beloved body piercer in Merritt Island, Florida. It looked like she had it all: friends, a twin sister by her side, and a fiancé who seemed like her perfect match. Phillip, however, had a different story. He was an MMA fighter with a tough physique and exterior, the type you'd expect from someone who spent years in the ring. He and Alicia found each other, and from the outside looking in, their relationship appeared to be thriving. So much so that on May 4th, 2021, Alicia posted these engagement photos on her Facebook. Her friends and family flooded the post with congratulations as the couple looked ready to start their forever. But at the same time, Phillip was battling a serious addiction, one that would soon tear their world apart. On May 14th, 2021, things came to a head. What should have been a simple disagreement spiraled into violence. The next day, police were called to the couple's apartment. When they arrived, they found Alicia dead from a gunshot wound. According to court documents obtained by WKMG-TV, Keller was the one who called 911, claiming he had found his fiancée's lifeless body and that it appeared to be the result of a robbery gone wrong.
Keller reported Ms. Campitelli was not conscious and not breathing.
But as investigators dug deeper, Keller's story quickly crumbled. Suspicious activity on Alicia's debit card raised immediate red flags, leading police to the suspect.
Our agents later located video surveillance recordings of Keller conducting suspicious financial transactions at multiple businesses using the victim's personal accounts at various times between when the witness reported hearing the gunshots and Keller's 911 call reporting the death.
Authorities say Keller withdrew more than $1,400 from Alicia's account after she died, and that he allegedly admitted to sheriff's deputies that the pair had been arguing about Phillip's drug use just before the shooting. In the heat of the argument, the MMA fighter allegedly went to their bedroom, grabbed Alicia's gun, loaded it, and then hid it in a closet. But the confrontation allegedly did not end there. According to the affidavit, he went back for the gun, and Alicia followed him. Moments later, things turned deadly. Keller described Alicia trying to protect herself, ducking behind a couch as she allegedly screamed, "Oh God, no," before he fired 2 more shots. Investigators say after the shooting, Keller threw the gun into a canal, but the truth wouldn't stay buried. 3 recorded phone calls revealed his guilt in raw, unfiltered detail. Keller's words would expose the chilling reality of what had happened. In the calls, Keller allegedly said, "I killed her, bro. I killed her, high as expletive. I don't know how I did it, but I can't live with myself knowing that. I'm a piece of expletive. I was super high on Molly." The 43-year-old was arrested and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, grand theft, fraudulent use of a credit card, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Before Alicia read to those who knew and loved her, the pain of her loss will never fade. And here to discuss this case with me is criminal defense attorney Natalie Whittingham-Burrell. Natalie, you've been a public defender for a long time. What were your first thoughts when you read this case?
Well, my first thoughts were how sad and random this was. But it seems that she was just trying to talk to her significant other about his addiction issue, and then he just turns around and shoots her out of the blue like that. It's actually quite heartbreaking because of just the randomness of it.
Right. And let's get into, his deal, right? The defendant took a plea deal and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. But, I don't know if you've been checking on social media. There's been a lot of public debate over whether a crime like this should warrant a life sentence instead. Now, for those that don't understand why, can you explain why a sentence of 50 years would be considered more appropriate than life?
Right. So a lot of the times in cases like this, what's really happening is that the parties, the prosecutor and the defense, are coming to an agreement. And they have to, in order to get the defendant to accept responsibility, sometimes give something up. So that would be normally the life sentence. Most people wouldn't take a plea in exchange for life. They would just go to trial. And then what he's giving up is any possibility of advancing a defense that he didn't know what he was doing because he was intoxicated. And a lot of the times, everyday people understandably don't like the feeling that this is a clear cut case of murder. This person should go away forever. However, you have to remember that trials are extremely emotionally taxing on the family. They're expensive, they're time consuming. And if you can get a defendant to admit guilt, take responsibility, a 50-year sentence is nothing to sneeze at. Sometimes, practically speaking, that is a life sentence because most people in their 30s don't actually have 50 years left in their life. Now, there is a possibility, with parole and things like that. However, it's practically speaking, a 50-year sentence is something more akin to a very hefty sentence and nearer to a life sentence. So, yes, it does not feel good to know that he killed this woman in cold blood like that. However, it is a compromise so that that responsibility is being accepted. He's not going to be getting out of it. He'll have that on his record forever, and he'll do a significant period of incarceration.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that he was under the influence or when he did this crime. Now, the case involves both a domestic dispute and a drug-fueled altercation. In your experience, how often do we see addiction as a contributing factor in domestic violence cases?
It's quite a common factor, and in some of the research, not all of it, but some of it, it can be a predictor for domestic violence. So substance use and abuse usually can amplify domestic violence or precipitate domestic violence because, as we all know, if anyone's ever been intoxicated, you don't need to have been on drugs, but just alcohol, for example, it lowers people's inhibitions. It messes with their ability to make executive decisions, to think twice or be future oriented about their decisions and their actions. So, someone that is prone towards violent behavior would be less likely to control themselves when they're under the influence. And it sounds like he was on Molly here. However, it does not mean that just because someone abuses substances that they're going to abuse someone, nor does it excuse the behavior, but it's certainly in the research and statistically has been shown to make domestic violence situations worse. So if someone is involved in a relationship that involves domestic violence or emotional abuse, it is very important to stay away from substances because they lower people's inhibitions.
And let's, talk more about that. While we don't know for certain if Alicia had experienced abuse prior to that night, for some people who may be in an abusive relationship, what are some of the common warning signs that they could look out for?
See, we have here the use of substances and the abuse of substances, which were clearly distressing to the victim here. And that's why they got into this, argument. So if you have a partner that is abusing illicit substances, that's usually a good indicator that, number one, that person needs help, but number two, that's not necessarily a safe environment. Also, he has a history of being an MMA fighter. I don't know if he's ever suffered any concussions, but prior concussions by the abuser is something that is a risk factor for abuse in the future. And once again, it doesn't mean that everyone that suffered a concussion or CTE or anything like that will go on to abuse someone else, but it is a risk factor. And then it's hard to say with this particular case because, like you said, there's no evidence of prior physical domestic violence, but any prior physical domestic violence would be a red flag. We see that a lot in criminal cases, that by the time it escalates to something where someone is being killed or seriously harmed, that usually is not the first time. So the first time is enough, right? The first time is enough.
Mhm.
You do not have to wait for a second time. usually you want to get out, because if someone's willing to put their hands on you the first time, there's nothing stopping them from escalating and doing it a second time and being more violent going forward.
Right. And what you're saying, I think, is extremely important for victims who have been abused but don't have, let's say, visible proof. I'm putting that in quotes, or who are experiencing abuse for the first time. How do attorneys approach cases where there's no established pattern of violence? Because some people just may be afraid to come forward because, they can't prove it, or, oh, it may have happened, just one time, things like that.
Right. Yeah, so on the prosecution side, you have to always remember that it's their job to prove the case that is in front of them. And a lot of the time, prior acts of violence don't come in. Sometimes they do, but let's say 7 out of 10 times they don't, right? So if it's enough and the victim is over it and they're ready to go forward to law enforcement, take pictures of your injuries, make sure that you go and you get medical treatment, get documentation for any abuse, and go to law enforcement and seek out that help. On the defense side of things, the lack of any evidence of prior abuse before this alleged abuse sometimes can be indicative of innocence in this particular circumstance, because, like I said, by the time someone goes to law enforcement or the prosecution to take out charges, it's usually a pattern of abuse or a system of abuse. But you do not need a pattern of abuse to pursue criminal charges. One time is enough. And the prosecution is very well adept at taking the case that they have and proving the case that they have. And it's on them to investigate the case, but it's in order to help that investigation, pictures of injuries and getting a second opinion, meaning don't just suffer in silence. Go to a doctor, go to a hospital, take pictures, get medical documentation, and go and take out those charges.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for joining us today. I'm hoping that, this information and this discussion could potentially save a life. So thank you.
Thank you.
Keller will be ineligible for parole or time off for good behavior until he has served at least 25 years in prison. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedy Walker.